Let's get started. Okay. I was diagnosed in 2020, with Parkinson's. I was misdiagnosed 3 years earlier with what's called essential tremor. And those essential tremors, they look the same until you find out they're not the same. So when I went to the doctor, in fact, Cindy didn't even go with me because we didn't think it was anything. Turned out that tsunami you saw in the corner, it's like, oh boy. I was shocked. I've never written poetry in my life. I thought, well, where'd the poetry come from? And I realized in hindsight that it was my brain giving me an emotional vocabulary that turned out to be poetry. It's a great way to kind of explain, well, there's a lot of, in fact, all the Mayo Clinic people are standing over there. There's a lot of great, we'll get to them. There's a lot of clinical information about Parkinson's. There's not much about what it feels like. So hopefully tonight we're going to give you a combination of both high-tech, high-touch. You know, I never planned to share any of this. I wrote this for myself. And Dr. Kendall Lee, who's also here somewhere, my neurosurgeon, there he is. He's the best in the country. We came to the other side of the neurosurgery, and he took the time to read all 11 poems to his nurse and me. And after he said, would you help me flip the script? And what he meant by that was, could we get to change the attitudes about deep brain stimulation so that it isn't the last treatment, it's the first or earlier, way earlier. We'll talk more about that tonight. So when he said that, it's like, how do you turn down like a world-class surgeon? I said, okay, sure, I'll go public with this stuff. And then I thought, what if I got myself into? And so I knew we needed more than words. We needed art. And Skylar is the next generation of Harry Potter. And she's a big fan of the person sitting next to her, Mary GrandPre, who did the Harry Potter illustrations. I said to Skylar, I was trying to impress her, I said, you know, I used to know Mary. And she thought, yeah, right. And the fact of the matter is I did know her because we'd worked together back in 1990. She had, coming out of MCAD, she had done some work for agency, and man, it was great work back then and great work today. So I decided to take a chance and call her. I said, Mary, how'd you like to change the world with me? How'd you like to do some work with this poetry? And she said, you know, I'm not doing illustration anymore. And I said, oh, she said, I'm really focusing on contemporary abstract art. I thought, well, okay, I'll just see if I can talk her into it. So I kept going about how cool it would be. And finally, to get me off the phone, she said, all right, fine, send me the work. True story. 2 days later, she called back and said, I'm in. Look at this work. 10 months later, she finished these 11 beautiful paintings you see here. And the summation of the paintings are so much more than just words. Her artistry actually, I think, took this whole thing to a level that wouldn't have been possible. It's just incredible. So my intuition paid off. Mary's going to be doing some selected interpretations of her work after we do some readings. And this is time for my good friend John Potter to come on up here. So, this is John Potter, and he is no relation to Harry. Are you? I don't think so.
Mary will discuss that.
And he's been kind enough to agree to read the poetry tonight because he's a hell of a lot better reader than I am. He's a trained actor. And so, the other thing you need to know about John is that today's his birthday. And what better way to spend your birthday than to read sad poems to strangers?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Happy birthday, buddy. So everyone that's ever had Parkinson's disease, almost, and I think that our friends from Rocksteady can tell you this, we're all looking for the same thing. We're looking for more control, and we're looking for a higher quality of life. How long can you do this? How long can you extend the quality? And the book is called No Turning Back because it's a relentless pursuit of those two things: control, quality of life. Every poem has something related to those two issues. So we've selected some poems tonight that we want to go through. And I hope that you'll, one more thing that's really important. There's a real range of emotion in the poetry that you're going to hear, but there's really only two stories here. A story of hope and a story of challenging norms. Because right now, people will, if you go online about Parkinson's, they say, wait till the medicine stops working. We're going to get into that. That's not how long you should wait, but that's where we're at. And so Dr. Lee said, let's start a movement, let's flip the script, and here we are. So at the time of diagnosis,
The verdict. At first, tremors are declared essential. Nothing to worry about, nothing to do. Trembling arm betrays me. Too late to hide the spectacle. Mortified as others pretend not to notice. Maybe there's a remedy. Maybe I can tame it. Maybe it's not essential. Neurologist asked about sleep. Well, sometimes I shout, sometimes I thrash. More interrogations, medical history. Finally, a fateful evaluation walk. A verdict is reached. Parkinson's disease. My sentence is degenerative and incurable. At first, it's as if we're talking about someone else, certainly not me. And then the enormity of it all comes crashing in. The verdict produces a seismic shift. I experience total vertigo. As my brain slowly catches up, it explodes. Without warning, a care team appears, one I'm not ready to join. After cheerful introductions like a new business meeting, I stagger out.
So, standing on the second floor of the University of Minnesota thinking, what the hell? And my first reaction was, you know what? I'm not going to tell anyone. I am not going to be a label.
Labels. Shorthand we all use. So powerful we need privacy laws to protect us. Cancer, depression, addiction, Parkinson's disease. Each label comes with its own debilitating social code. Before the verdict, I was normal, simply a tremor. In a single moment, the verdict changed everything. The stigma is sudden and forever. With it come assumed limitations. How people see me, how I see myself. Those in the inner circle say PD. PD is impossible to hide. But I tried. Not going to be defined by a label, Parkinson's disease. Not going to cry when I shared my label. But I did. People say, I'm so sorry. What else is appropriate? Each time I hear it, I feel weak, angry, diminished.
So as a result of that diagnosis, I decided to sell my business. Thank you very much, Lois. She's here. And I spent a year in studying PD and trying to figure out, well, what's the solution for PD? What else do we need to know? When you go into the rabbit hole, let me tell you, the first thing you learn about PD is stages of PD. And it's like looking into an abyss because you find out there's things you can't do.
What will I do? What will I do when my hands are no longer mine? My camera trembles. Images stop telling their stories. What will I do when my guitar goes silent? How will I cope when my legs refuse to support me, my bike stowed away forever, confined to a world pushed by others? How will I cope when life gets too small? Who will I be when my mind has gone elsewhere, trapped without words behind a frozen mask, lost to those I love? Who will I be then? Is there dignity without control? Perhaps the hidden gift is an early exit. Shadows haunt me.
When Dr. Lee read that, he kind of flipped out about early exit. And I said to him, nobody wants to be a burden on their family. Well, the other thing I discovered was we're coming through the other side of that, and I realized that there's this thing called deep brain stimulation surgery. And what's amazing about it is how hard it is to qualify. The evaluation process is crazy. It's just crazy. And so the reason it's so hard is that they don't want to do elective brain surgery on people unless they know it's going to help them. So the next poem is about that evaluation process.
The gauntlet wanted to impress, wanted to be worthy, the perfect candidate. Word fluency. First up, name all the words you can think of starting with the letter S in 60 seconds. Slip sliding through my S's at a show-stopping, scintillating speed, stressing, squeezing every single syllable. At 30 seconds, I smacked into a stone structure. Suddenly, sadly, stumped. 5 hours to go. Motor control. Off meds. Circle drawings look like I had my eyes closed while operating a jackhammer. On meds, drawings look like circles. Drawing hands on the clock, nailed it. 4 hours to go. Memory. Asked, who's president of the United States? Answered, depends on who you ask. 3 shots at remembering 12 words. Got 8 right. Couldn't remember complex, in-depth story details. Who cares what Mr. Stephen J. Strutz was wearing on what day, at what time, at what address, while doing what to whom? I'd make a lousy witness. 3 hours to go. Depression evaluation. Psychologist and I really connected, not depressed. 1 hour to go. MRI. Usually takes 20 minutes. Kept having neck spasms and uncontrollable tremors as meds wore off. 40 minutes later, I was done.
I prayed they'd give me another shot. And then I found out I was approved. It's kind of shocking. Preliminarily approved, I should say. But I kept hearing, you know what, you should wait. Even though Oxford University studies had shown that early intervention is the way to go with Parkinson's. And there's been a study done by Vanderbilt University. At 5 years, they found that people who had deep brain stimulation surgery early were doing as well in terms of safety, but much better than people who had optimum therapeutic drug use. And so I was kind of flabbergasted that I want to talk about the therapeutic window for a second. So let's pretend that you're going to wait for the drugs to wear off. You've got about that much time left by the time we get to DBS, right? Well, what we're finding is if you can get into this side of the window of FDA-approved, which is it's still 4 years, it's not like tomorrow. Look at me. Isn't that great? Because of those 2 guys over there, but still, I'm back to being a mediocre guitar player. I'm My photography is much better than it used to be. I was losing about 30% of my photography to camera shake, and that's all gone. And I'm not being on meds for a year and a half. It's like I'm a year and a half ahead of the game right now. So that's important, but I couldn't believe that we're still dealing with the fact that we're looking at things as old-time thinking, if you will, about when to have this surgery as being last resort. My frustration came out in a way that I think will kind of explain that.
In a box. The tremors are light. My body is fine. They say I'm the lucky one. They say it's too early. The future is set. We all follow the same worn path. What I take is prescribed by others. Side effects are expected. The more I take, the worse it gets. Whirling, shaking, loss of control. The goal is to wait until things get bad. That's when it's safe to drill. If all goes well, not all is lost. Minor gains feel like miracles. Turning the clock back is not beating the clock. The damage is done. The few who have gone early are doing the best. More stimulation means fewer drugs. It's not a cure. The end is the same. I'm playing for time. Rules are inflexible. There's only one way. Increase the dose, add another pill. There is no choice. I'm in a box waiting for things to get bad.
Well, the good news is I was finally approved for surgery, I think, in the sense that I kept thinking to myself, this is both exhilarating and terrifying, right? I thought, be careful for what you wish for. I hope that we don't have any bad outcomes. And will I be strong enough for the surgery? I think that the back end of this surgery is sort of like a prayer.
No turning back. It started unlike any other day. It started with trepidation and hope, trusting my very essence to others, committing to whatever the outcome. No turning back. Awake and present, I'm part of the team, yet apart. Awake and drifting, mild anesthesia to quell my anxiety. I want to remind them that I'm here, under the surgical draping, a living, breathing human, risking everything for more quality time. No turning back. They said the risks were low, no guarantees. They said very little pain. Oh, but the smells, sounds, and vibrations, a cacophony of cutting, drilling, burning, stitching, burr holes in my skull, perfectly placed probes relying on finely honed skills. No turning back. And then the surgeon said, listen, that's the tremor we're hearing. And then the room got quiet. My brain was telling them, that's the spot. Turning on the probes, suddenly the tremors stopped. My toe stopped curling. As they tested the parameters of the stimulation, I knew we made it. No turning back.
Woo! Thanks, John. I was really fortunate to have the best, maybe one of the best surgical teams in the country, if not the world. Dr. Klassen and Dr. Lee led me through getting through the whole maze that you have to go through to get qualified for the surgery. And we came through the other side, and that's why we're here. We're going to start a movement.
Turning on, the moment of truth, the moment of completing an arduous journey, euphoric by the outcome, emotionally drained by the process. challenging the status quo without alienating the team. They say, "You're early." I say, "Time's running out." DBS is still considered the treatment of last resort. Technology over pharmaceuticals is the right choice. New data has not altered old attitudes. Better to be safe. My experience supports the data. Better control, fewer drugs, no side effects. They say programming would be tedious. Be realistic about outcomes. I'm not looking for miracles. I'm looking for control. Programming is uneventful, no surprises, subtle yet profound. Tremors gone, dystonia gone, worries gone. At first, it's hard to trust the feeling. The next night, something wakes me. Something's different. Thinking and movements more fluid. I'm back. An evangelist is born. DBS is the best tool we have. Turning on, never turning back.
Thanks. I would like now to introduce my co-creator, Mary GrandPre. And Mary is, I think I've already said how amazing her approach is, but she's going to share with you, this is a treat, because she's going to share with you her process of turning the poetry into a story. Mary?
So it's great to be here tonight, and it's such an honor to have worked on John's poetry and brought some visual life to it. Not an easy project for me to tell somebody else's personal, emotional, powerful story written in poetry form when, I'm not the one experiencing it, and I had to be really careful and really mindful about how to show this really important story. So my background is as a children's book illustrator, and although this is a book, it's certainly not a children's book, and audience is totally different, but there's still a line, there's a journey, there's a path, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and so it's a very narrative thing, even though it's poetic. So my main challenge was to understand as much as I could the emotional quality and the emotional weight of what John was saying, and to, if I could in any way, put myself in his place, which of course I can't, but as an artist you want to be true to the author, and this was a totally different kind of story to tell for me. Also the fact that I was painting abstract paintings and I wasn't really painting books at that point. So I tried to bring an element of my abstract work to the narrative part too and combine it into what I was hoping would become a powerful painting, as powerful as John's beautiful words. They're very visual. His poetry is so visual. It was, in a way, it was easy, but it was just also challenging too. But so just to tell you a little bit about the piece that's up there now, The Verdict. That's actually, there's probably about 3 paintings under that painting. We were just trying to go through what it felt like to get the news that John had Parkinson's disease. And what does it actually feel like? And I think there's a painting under there that shows a guy falling through the floor. That's how I thought it might feel, and we talked about it. The seismic shift that John talked about. But it wasn't quite working, and we got on the phone quite a bit throughout this whole process so that I could call John and ask him, John, would you just tell me your feelings about this part of your journey? I would be reading a poem to him, and he'd say, On this one, he said, it actually felt like a tsunami was crushing down on me. Sitting there in the office and getting the words, you have Parkinson's disease, it felt like a tsunami. And I thought, wow, what a powerful image. And so that was really John's idea, to bring that wave in. And I just had to figure out how to visually do it. And it worked that time. And then I added the lines of the room to kind of show the containment of him and the fact that he was alone. Even though there were other people in the room, I'm sure it felt like you were alone in this place. The other piece I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight was the gauntlet, when he was going through all the testing and all the questions and things to beat the clock and become eligible for this surgery. And so what was that going to be like? First, it's hard to take a concept that's more of an idea than an actual event. The idea of jumping through hoops and answering questions and, proving yourself capable of the surgery. How do you show that? Well, I thought maybe a marionette, being controlled by your brain. You didn't really have control over, and so you were at the power of the ability of your own brain to prove yourself. And so there's a lot of layering and collage and symbols and numbers and question marks and all this chaos that must have felt chaotic. That's how I pictured it, going through all these tests that day. A lot of pressure, and although you were quite humorous through the telling, but you are anyway, so I don't know how you do that, but you do. But, I just came up with that image of the brain controlling the movements and the answers, and it was just kind of fun that way to do. And then the no turning back piece. I just thought of a bridge, that you're on this one side of the bridge where you're on all this medication. And so if you look close, the bridge is made up of a lot of pills, and it's all made out of the medication. And then the other side of the bridge is circles, and there's a lot of circles showing up in the visuals because it represents clocks and time. Sometimes it represented a hoop to jump through, or a sun or a moon or something, but clocks was a common theme because of the need for more time in your life. So he crosses over from the medication to more time. We talked about, how does he get to the other side? And below you see him, actually, he's in surgery. And when he saw this piece, he said, that kind of feels like that's how it felt when I was in surgery, to have your head kind of secured by this device that would hold your head still. So it actually became the negative space under the bridge. And it worked out that way. But we had to figure out how this character, who is also him on top, crosses over. And we had a discussion about, is it a pathway that crosses over, a road? And we thought about how he talks about the precise probe, the very delicate precision that happens during surgery. So we thought it should be just a very thin line that he walks across. But that thin line was a very powerful crossing over for him. Anyway, there's a lot of symbolism in most of the pieces, and you have to look close and enjoy looking at the original paintings, find the layers and the symbols within, and read the poetry and find out how it works together for you as a viewer. But thank you for having me tonight, and thank you, John, for letting me do this.
Take the time if you gave. Don't forget dessert, but take the time to look at each one of those paintings because they're really amazing. She just did beautiful work. Thank you, Mary. Okay, it's time for the doctors. We have two of Mayo Clinic's finest, and they're going to talk about the future of DBS. I'm going to start with Dr. Bryan Klassen, who's become a friend and is considered one of the most respected movement disorder neurologist in the country, and a neuro programmer. He has a team that works with him. And when I heard that he was going to be the guy programming me, I asked the reps at Medtronic, I said, what do you know about Klassen? And they said, this man is the best in the country. So you're going to hear from the best, and I'm honored to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the state of deep brain stimulation, focusing on a couple of new developments in the field as they sit now. It'll be a little less artistic, though I'll show you my own version of artwork toward the end here. But just as a little background, so So Parkinson disease, at least in Western medicine, was described best in 1817 by Dr. James Parkinson. He put together this essay. This is his essay on the shaking palsy. This is the art from that actual manuscript, and he described a handful of patients, some of which he just saw on the street in London, some of whom were his patients, and described the cardinal features: the resting tremor, the stupid posture, as you can see here, the slow movements, and so that's where we get the name Parkinson disease. And unfortunately, in his day, there was not a whole lot that could be done for these people who suffered from Parkinson's, and there was just continued progression, more and more rigidity, more and more tremor, and very early disability. But as time went on in the early 20th century, it was found that Parkinson disease actually had a neuroanatomical substrate, and you can see in the upper left the substantia nigra, which you've heard about. It's the black substance is the English version of that, was actually missing or at least lighter in patients with Parkinson disease. And if you look under the microscope, you can see these darker cells are missing or dying off. And those are the dopamine-producing cells. So this was seen in the early 20th century, but it wasn't really until the 1960s that they found that it was dopamine that was deficient in Parkinson's disease. And later on, so within that same decade, levodopa, which is a precursor to dopamine, was evaluated as a treatment and found to be actually quite helpful for patients with Parkinson's disease. So that's the levodopa era is how we call that. And it really was a game changer for patients because now there was a way they could regain their function with that exercise, which probably prevents or slows progression on its own. And it was really helpful for people. Over time, though, as patients were on levodopa and Parkinson's progressed below it, it was found that sometimes levodopa didn't last as long, or some patients would get extra movements, the dyskinesia that can come along with it. And so there was a lot of attempt pharmaceutically to find a better approach. And this slide shows all the medicines now that we have. The ones in red are ones that have been released in the last few years. You can see, first of all, levodopa, all of the ones, dopamine precursor in the upper left, those are all versions of levodopa. So a lot of even the new medicines are just more ways to take levodopa. And then there's a whole laundry list of other kinds of medications that can be adjunctive, and again, some of these are newer. What to make of all this? How to navigate this? Because that's a whole lot of medication. Well, this is from a neurology little newspaper for neurologists that came out about a year ago discussing this issue. And the new medications, a lot of these new medications, they're evolutionary. They're not really revolutionary compared to levodopa. They can be helpful sometimes for treating symptoms, but sometimes not, and they're always more expensive, particularly the new ones, and rarely suitable as first-line therapy. So levodopa is still the first line and the gold standard therapy for Parkinson's disease in 2023. The interesting thing to me is if you look back, say, 2,000 years ago, I talked about Dr. Parkinson introducing this concept to Western medicine. If you look at the Indian medical tradition from India, they had a condition they called Kamvata, and they have specific symptoms. These are all words in ancient Indian, but each of them describes a very specific symptom, including tremor, rigidity, bradykinesia. So they basically had described Parkinson's disease over 2,000 years ago. And they treated it with this herb, Atmagapta, and it's a type of velvet bean that today we call Mucuna parens. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. But that is, some people take that as sort of an herbal alternative to levodopa, but more or less that contains the active ingredient carbidopa levodopa. So this medication has been actually used for over 2,000 years. It's still the gold standard medication. John had mentioned, typically the FDA labeling for deep brain stimulation involves 4 years. That's to make sure patients actually have Parkinson's. And also a lot of people do okay initially, at least, on levodopa for what we would call the honeymoon period. And I think if you wanted to define that, in the most conservative term, you'd say people start levodopa 3 times a day. You take it maybe morning, noon, evening. And a lot of folks will be just fine for a while. Won't notice any problem, have a lot of their symptoms treated. And that's because even though the medication level is going up and down and up and down every time you take the pill, you're keeping the level that you need for effect or efficacy higher than where you need it, and you're keeping side effect below the side effect threshold. So things are okay. But as the disease progresses, patients can have issues where the threshold can shift a little. And now, as the medication dips down, there's going to be symptoms. So you have a little tremor come out or a little tightness come out as the medication wears down. Or on the flip side, as the medication gets to its highest dose, now maybe you're above the threshold for extra squirmy movements or other kind of side effect to levodopa. So there can be, as Parkinson's advances, patients who no longer sit in that honeymoon, right, of just 3 times a day levodopa doing pretty well. And so what to do? Well, one option is to adjust levodopa medication. So you can take levodopa more often. You can take it in different ways. I told you the different forms I showed on that slide. Or you could add medications to levodopa, this whole laundry list of medications. Some of these can be helpful. I think in appropriate patients, it's a good idea to try some things. But they're not necessarily able to really split the difference all the way, and sometimes patients still have a lot of issues with fluctuation or dyskinesia, despite a couple of reasonable medication options. And I agree with John, I don't think you need to spend years and years going through this whole laundry list of medication before you think of something that might be a little more effective. So the idea, fundamentally, with deep brain stimulation is to take this scenario where patients, maybe they're too high sometimes, too low sometimes, and you are able to widen that window back up, the therapeutic window between effect of the medicine and side effect of too high of a dose. And so that's what DBS is trying to do, is widen that window so patients just do better. Typically they are on medication, but some lucky folks like John can get off the medication altogether, if it's that effective for them. So that's sort of where we're at coming to deep brain stimulation. Now, deep brain stimulation has been around for a long time. DBS has been around and FDA-approved at least since 2002. So it's over 20 years old. We target or put the probe in the subthalamic nucleus or the globus pallidus interna. These are 2 structures deep in the brain. You can see them in this lower left picture. Those probes are in the structure called the subthalamic nucleus. And we're using this, as I mentioned, when patients either have fluctuation, so the levodopa wears down between doses, or maybe there's extra squirmy movement starting to come out, or maybe there's tremor and it's just not really getting better, even though you're trying the medicine. That's one reason to do this. And some patients can't be on medicine. They have side effect or nausea or other issues. So these are kind of the classic indication, maybe not the FDA-approved sort of laundry list, but this is medically the 4 things we're looking for to show that something's that this is a medically appropriate procedure. And of course, there are potential complications, and that's really the reason why we want to make sure that there's not a really easy way with medication to handle the problem, because it fortunately went very well for John, but in some very rare cases, there can be complications that we're always thinking about and we always have in the back of our minds. So I want to talk about this 20-year-old therapy, what's new, what's coming. And some of these things have been out for the last few years. Some of these things are coming along, but I think they're changing the field and making it a little more exciting for me as a programmer, because it's more fun to program, and I think they're making it better for the patients who have an easier time garnering benefit from the therapy. So one of the things actually that's been around for a couple years now, and all of the systems have this, is what we call segmented electrodes. If you look at how we were doing DBS 10 years ago, there were 4 spots or 4 contacts, 4 electrodes, where you could spit out electricity through these. So you could move a little bit up or a little bit down, but it was always going to be around in a circle around the electrode. So if your electrode was too low or too high, you could adjust for that. But if your electrode was 2 to the left or 2 to the right or 2 forward or 2 back, you really couldn't. Because if you look at the projection down the electrode, it was a circle. And now the companies, you can see a little bit of a space there. There's the middle two levels actually have 3 little segments, and now you can put an electrical field there that is not concentric, or it's not right around the electrode, but gets pushed to one side. And the way this can be helpful is, let's say you have a side effect that is maybe tingling, maybe speech problems, something like this. Well, if it's close enough to the electrode, maybe right behind and to the left here, you might end up getting that side effect at the time you get tremor control. Maybe with the new strategy, you can push it a little bit off in the direction and avoid the side effect and still get your control. So this is something that's made programming more complicated, but also in the patients who need this therapy has made it potentially more effective. As I said, it makes it a little more complicated, and in the old days, right, 10, 20 years ago, we would just see the patient, start trying things, and see what worked. But that can take a while. And so one thing we would do is get picture or CT scan. You could look at where the electrode was. But you can see the CT shows the electrode really well, but the brain is always a little fuzzy. CTs aren't the best way to look at brain tissue necessarily. And now there are different strategies to bring all the imaging together. I call it image-guided programming. But this is an MRI. So this is a patient's MRI and the CT. You can see the MRI shows tissue a lot better. And now you can fuse these together, right? So you can see the lead, the DBS lead on that patient's MRI. You get a better sense. This is actually in the thalamus, so not not the STN, but a different target. What you can even do is you can take standard brains. These are brains that are averages of multiple MRIs, and you can merge that particular patient into a space like that. And then you can look at an atlas. So these are standard atlases. And so the long and short of it is you come up with a figure like this. So this is my artwork for today, where this is one of our patients where you see the targets, you see the probes, you see the direction that they're facing. That's what the top marker is. And you kind of can see, well, boy, I want to use the contact that's one up from the bottom on this side and maybe two up from the bottom on this side. And I maybe want to go in this direction. So it's very helpful, particularly with a more complicated electrode that we have now. And so there's various ways that this can be done, but we find it very useful. Here's just a case example of a patient where we more or less programmed a patient with Parkinson's based on what seemed to work the best. And they went home, and unfortunately this patient developed a little bit of elevated mood. So it's a rare complication, but you can get mania actually. So elevated mood, there's mood circuits that go through the STN, and that's what happened. So they came back, and we instinctively know that the mood centers are lower down. So we instinctively raised the field up. You can see it's probably coming from this left one because it's stimulating toward the bottom of that structure. So we just moved it up. The patient did better, and this is kind of what they went home with, and they had much better mood, but they had more tremor. They had more Parkinson symptoms. And so what we're able to do with this strategy is kind of think, well, how can we still get the motor structure and avoid the mood structure that's farther forward? And so we were able to kind of look and play around and come up with a different strategy that really tucked right against the border of that structure. And so this is just an example of how this technology can be helpful, and that patient did really well with that. Another thing that's coming along is the idea of adaptive stimulation. So conventionally, for the last 20 years, we find the setting that works, and then that goes in there. It stays there. It's a 100 hertz buzz or higher, so it's just a buzz that's the same all day long, all night long. It has advantages. Like John said, a lot of people do really well overnight because you have some kind of therapy there all the time. It's not necessarily going to consider what's happening with the patient. So you might be out walking, you might be sitting doing nothing, you may be using fine motor control, you may not be, you may be sleeping. And so it's not really adapting to what's going on. This is a busy slide, I'm not going to go over everything, but the long and short of it is now there are brain waves in these deep structures that actually can correlate with the severity of Parkinson's symptoms at the time, right? So the brain waves can have a signal, they get better, if you will, when the medication kicks in and someone's doing better. If the medicine wears off or symptoms are worse, they'll get worse. And these brain waves can be tracked now by devices. And this is an example of one of these where one of these we can do it now if you have this device in. You can see on the left there's 3 curves, and you're looking for this brain wave, this brain signal suggesting that that's where the Parkinson's symptoms can maybe be best addressed. And you can see that orange curve right there is the highest, and so that's these middle 2 contacts. And so looking at that right now would tell you, hey, maybe we should go after this area of the electrode. So that can be helpful along with the imaging to guide our programming. And then something exciting that's not quite yet here yet is you can track the response of these signals to stimulation itself. And so that's the bottom right. This is one of my patients in clinic. I did this where you look that blue line. Simplistically, if the blue line's high, they have more Parkinson's symptoms. If it's low, they have less. And the red line is the stimulation. So they came in off stimulation. You can see the blue line's kind of going around. And as I turned up the stimulation, the blue line kind of comes down. That's the brainwave signal corresponding to Parkinson's symptoms. So you can watch that, and that's interesting. But the next step, which is not here yet, but is hopefully coming along, would be an adaptive approach where almost like a thermostat, right? So you can see on that top, this is from a study, a research study, this isn't available clinically, but you can see as that line on the top, which is the sort of signal that Parkinson's is getting worse, as it crosses that threshold, it's like the thermostat set to 70 degrees, right? Then it crosses that, you can see stimulation, the green line kicks on. And then as the Parkinson's get better, stimulation maybe turns off. So it might be a way to kind of more smartly control stimulation despite patients having different brain states at the time. And so that's something that's in trial. So Medtronic has a trial, and other companies trying to gear up a trial as well with this. These are just some of the new things. So even though DBS is 20 years old, we do have a lot of new strategies to really utilize the systems much better and more effectively. But this all depends on having those electrodes in an appropriate position where we can use them. If they're not in a good spot, or if the patient can't tolerate the procedure to get them there, then we as neurologists can't do anything. And so I'm going to turn over to Dr. Lee, who's going to talk about some advances surgically.
I really look forward to tonight. It's wonderful to see all of you here. And Mr. Foley, let me congratulate you on putting together an amazing book with the art, the poems, and this evening. This is really a round of applause for Mr. Foley. So what I was hoping to do was share with you a few stories from a neurosurgeon's perspective. You know, I think it's really good that I went after Dr. Klassen because he did all of the science and so forth. But I want to show you and tell you, here's my disclosure as well. I'm going to describe some of the technologies that we're developing at the Mayo Clinic. What's really interesting about this story actually starts at Mayo Clinic. Now, Mayo Clinic, as all of you know, was recently voted as the #1 hospital, not only in the nation, but in the world as well. You can see all the numbers here in terms of the consultants. And now, of course, Mayo Clinic is really not only within US, but it's becoming global. And we're really excited about this because the one principle that we live by, and it's the reason for this growth, is simply the needs of the patient comes first. That's one of the reasons why I love working at the Mayo Clinic. Long time ago, there was a neurosurgeon named Irving Cooper at Mayo Clinic. And what you may not know is before L-DOPA that Dr. Klassen told you about, neurosurgeons were actually the ones who was treating the Parkinson's patients, particularly the ones with the incredible tremor. What we used to do was, because the tremor can be so bad and it's all the time, we would do what's called a craniotomy, which means we open the head, go in, and we would actually paralyze the patient. Hemiparalysis, where we lift up the temporal lobe, which is right there, go in and cut the fibers that control your motor system from your brain to your spinal cord. We would actually cut it. I know that sounds so illogical and so forth, but if you were constantly doing this all the time, to paralyze half of the body made sense back then. Remember, there was no medicine that before L-DOPA that we could help these patients. And so Dr. Irving Cooper got his neurosurgery training at Mayo, got his PhD at Mayo, but at the time, the degree was conferred from University of Minnesota, completed his studies, and was doing these surgeries in New York. During one of those surgeries, he accidentally cut an artery called enterochoroidal artery, which is deep within the brain, which caused bleeding. Now here is where the genius was. Rather than completing what's called a pedunculotomy, which means you cut those nerves to make the patient paralyzed, he simply ligated that bleeding vessel and closed up. The patient awoke, and at that time, it was felt that the patient had to be paralyzed for treatment, with no tremor on that side, but still able to move. Now, Dr. Irving Cooper, apparently he was this movie star-like figure, very handsome, very smart, all of this, and presented this at meetings, but nobody would believe him. Why? Because at that time, the thought was, in order to treat tremor, you had to paralyze the patient. You can't just get rid of the tremor alone. What he discovered through many of these surgeries was that you didn't have to actually ligate those. He reasoned that what he was really doing was the blood vessel, by ligating it, was causing a mini stroke, a tiny little stroke. And indeed, what he reasoned was instead of going in and ligating the vessel, he would drill a tiny little hole and with a stereotactic device go in and burn that area of the brain. And amazingly, that worked too. So these patients were having tremors before it would go in, burn the brain, and no more tremors coming out, but able to move. If you want to read an amazing book, he wrote an autobiography of that experience called The Vital Probe. What's amazing is I think at the end he became very depressed because nobody believed him. What is amazing about that story is when L-DOPA came out, this neurosurgeon gave up the surgery and said, we don't need to do that anymore, but we need to give the drug. Then the story goes to Dr. Alain Benabit in Grenoble, France. And in France, what was happening was he was doing the Irving technique of going in and trying to ligate these areas, burn it. And by burning it, we can treat tremor. But Dr. Benabit did one additional thing because, as Dr. Klassen just told you, the brain, these are very important areas that if you burn the wrong area, you could paralyze somebody. And so before doing the burning, what he did was he stimulated just to make sure that it's not the area that would cause bad side effects. But amazingly, what he found was the stimulation now stopped the tremors. And that's how the modern era of DBS was born. And indeed, I came to Mayo Clinic now 18 years ago. And originally, I'm from South Korea. I came to America at the age of 10 and absolutely love this country. In Colorado, I was one of the first Koreans to live there. But this country took us in, gave us special English teachers, my sister and I, to learn English. And I can tell you, I love this country. What other country can you go and become an American? It's amazing to me, even now. Studied neurosurgery because I wanted to understand the brain and how does this organ can see and perceive and think. And then when I was at Dartmouth, there was one surgery. Remember, I became a neurosurgeon actually to take tissue out to treat epilepsy. Initially, I was trained as an epilepsy surgeon. But during my neurosurgery training at Dartmouth, they were doing one of these DBS surgeries. In fact, I was involved in the very first one at Dartmouth. It was a Parkinson's patient with tremor. We went in to the target, we found it. And this at that time was excruciating surgery, 13 hours of surgery to find the right place. But when we found the right place and stimulated, the tremor stopped in the OR. It was amazing to me. To be honest, initially I thought this was voodoo. How could you put an electrode, a wire into the brain and cure Parkinson's? Made no sense to me. So even though I trained as an epilepsy surgeon, I switched. I was captivated. Actually, let me tell you, most of the time, no other resident wanted to do those surgeries because you were there for hours and hours and hours. And my old colleagues, they said, okay, fine, let's get Kendall, you go in. And so I did. And I gave a lecture, and at this lecture, Dr. Fred Meyer, who at the time was the chairman at neurosurgery of Mayo, told me, you need to come to Mayo. Because at the time, I was presenting on what is the mechanism, what's going on, how are we doing this? And that's why I was recruited to Mayo, and he asked me to please don't do gazillions of surgery. That's not what Mayo is about. I want you to come, spend half of your time figuring this out and developing the next generation technology. So let me tell you, most neurosurgery places will not give a neurosurgeon 50% time just to go to the lab because they want us to generate a lot of money. You know, because neurosurgeons generate tons of money for the hospital. It takes an incredible hospital to have the forethought to tell a surgeon, no, stop. You know, this is kind of like the story, I'm sure you know, about the 7 habits of highly effective people, you know. You know, they tell you, you know, there's a story in there where there's a guy who's chopping down a tree. His friend comes and says, hold on, why don't you sharpen that axe? The guy says, well, can't you see I'm busy chopping down this tree? It's that idea. Stop and figure things out, find a better way. You can see here, Dr. Bennett is in the audience, who co-directed neuroengineering laboratories. Give a round of applause for Dr. Bennett, who was the chair of Division of Engineering to help us to develop the new technologies. And then others, this whole team, we've been working very hard on trying to figure out, because we're now treating essential tremor, Parkinson's, obsessive compulsive disorder, dystonia. These are all FDA approved now. We're now using this technology for depression, for Tourette, for pain, Alzheimer's, and believe it or not, we're now using it for drug addiction. Right now, the world, it's just, you know, the fentanyl epidemic. So many people are dying, which is also related to dopamine as well, but in another circuit of dopamine. So we're now working on technologies that can actually control the dopamine systems. And in fact, one of the theories that we raised on how DBS works is that we are probably modulating the brain dopamine system. And that's why we're able to cut down on medications. And indeed, I want to introduce also Dr. Yunbei Oh, who's invented this new technique of MCSWV, who can measure human dopamine levels. And now developing closed-loop deep brain stimulation that, just like Dr. Klassen talked about, the thermostat. So at the Mayo Clinic and the neuroengineering laboratories, we've raised over $60 million to develop these next generation technologies, mostly funded by the National Institute of Health, as well as donors, incredible patients that realize that it's about not today's medicine, but tomorrow's technology that needs to happen today because our patients are waiting. And in addition, we are now working on better ways to do the surgery. We developed, as Mr. Foley has said, this way of clamping the head, which is really, really painful. So I can tell you, many patients who come to surgery, I speak to them the day before surgery, and they're incredibly anxious. There are a few things, which is, one, everybody that gets your brain operated on awake is scared. You can imagine, if I tell you I'm going to put your head in that device and screw it in, you'll be scared, right? And I always have to have a talk with my patients beforehand because they're so nervous, so nervous. Now, the gentleman that was standing next to me, I think is, oh, there you are, who is a good friend of Mr. Foley, okay? When you were speaking earlier, said, I'm a good friend of Mr. Foley. And the other word you said is, he's courageous. And I always tell my patients, because they're scared, courage, unfortunately, requires fear. You must overcome that fear. Because indeed, if you're not afraid, where is the fear? If you don't have fear, then you don't have courage. It's not possible. I can tell you, I had joined the military. I went to war, the Afghan war, treating our wounded warriors. And the one thing that I realize is our wonderful wounded warriors, when they go, it's not that they're not afraid of the gunshots. They do it anyway because it's higher level. Your cortex, your frontal lobe controls your fear. So it is in the face of fear that you have courage. And what I realize is that every single patient that I operated on and will operate on have this tremendous courage, which is amazing. But now with technology, we have invented this device right there that replaces that. This just got FDA approved. We have just done 28 patients on this. And when I asked, do you want that or that? There were patients that were actually waiting for this. So we understand how to put this, that key, the frame, the localization system. And this is now replacing the frame system. I don't do that anymore. I was so frustrated that I have to do what I did, but that was the best technology up until just a year ago. Only available at the Mayo Clinic right now, but we are now talking to so many centers that are interested in this. And the way it works is we use complex mathematics now to really navigate the whole head. As you can see, the X, Y, Z coordinate systems, the arc angle, collar angle, and it's been just absolutely wonderful developing this system at the Mayo Clinic and the neuroengineering laboratories. And now, Mayo Clinic has allowed us, and in full disclosure, to start companies. Why? Because what I realized in running the neuroengineering laboratories, that I don't anymore want to only do from bench to bookshelf research that is just published, but we must make a difference in our patients' lives. And this is one way that we're doing it. And the surgical protocol, all the testing that's required. And in addition, look at this. So when I came to Mayo Clinic 18 years ago, my surgeries took 13 hours. Now you can say, oh my goodness, that's hard for the staff. But what about the patient? Can you imagine if you were the patient doing surgery for 13 hours? It was excruciating. We're now doing this kind of surgeries in 78 minutes at the Mayo Clinic. We're now also using amazing technologies at Mayo. We have the first 7 Tesla clinical system. And we're identifying how to image. Look. So here you see 1.5 Tesla, you see 3 Tesla, 70. These imaging technologies, Mr. Foley, you said that you heard your own brain. We still do brain recordings where we have to listen to the brain to identify where to go. But these kind of technologies are now showing us through imaging where we need to target. It's really game-changing. And we're developing newer technologies that can be used in the 7T system, like this, evaluating the distortions, the software systems. And indeed, we're now able, in some patients, able to do this surgery asleep because so many patients are so anxious and they do not want this surgery away. And we have now at the Mayo Clinic completed 5 of these surgeries and able to record from the brain while they're asleep. And this is what you see. So you were talking about the action potentials. These are the signals that our brain has when we're thinking, when we're moving. And in the STN, we can listen. In this case, another target for Parkinson's is GPI, globus pallidus. And so Dr. Klassen does all of these brain recordings that accurately tells us exactly where to go. And then this is a video, I'm not going to play it, but of the asleep DBS where we can now do the brain surgery part and the battery. Normally what we do is we do the brain surgery 1 week, and then a week later the patient comes back to get the battery. Now we're working on doing the whole surgery in one, and we're excited about that. Oh, the video's working actually. So you can see that this is how it works. That's me putting it on. You can see the patient is asleep, and over there, after the implant, we can just tunnel and put the battery in all in one. And the patient is now under general anesthesia. That's me setting up this system. And so what I want to say in closing is just I want to leave you with one more story that's personal. And that is, long time ago, I visited my grandmother, and she had tremors, she had mask-like faces, she couldn't move, she had dementia, but we didn't know that she had Parkinson's. Years later, I was visiting my mother, and she had tremor and mask-like faces, but and couldn't move. Initially, you know what's so weird about having close family members is denial. I'm a physician that specializes in Parkinson's disease, but I didn't want to believe that my mother had Parkinson's. My grandmother had it. Now my mother has it. And remarkably, as L-DOPA, it was amazing. Another thing that happened that's really amazing for my mother is shortly after my father died, the day after the funeral, she had a stroke, a tiny little stroke. Amazing thing was that stroke happened in her STN, which means the stroke actually initially caused paralysis, but then that went away and it helped with her Parkinson's, which is just ironic, isn't it? And because I know that area of the brain, I saw her scan and I said, oh my goodness, this is like a miracle. But Parkinson's, therefore, has a special meaning to me as well because it's hereditary, some parts of it. And I know it runs in my family. And sometimes when I'm operating on my patients, I worry, what if I get it? And therefore, every time I operate, I actually see myself in there. What I tell my patients is every patient that comes to me, I have to make a decision. Do I offer this patient surgery? Some patients are incredibly complicated. They're on Coumadin, a blood thinner, which is very dangerous to operate on patients such as this, or heart failure, and so forth. So we at the Mayo Clinic have a committee called DBS Committee, which Foley talked about it, that passes and looks at every single patient individually and decide as a group, can we offer this patient surgery? And as a surgeon, I have to weigh out what are the benefits versus risk, and it's actually a simple calculation. In which direction is that balance? And therefore, I offer the patient surgery would I operate if this patient is my mother or my grandmother or myself sitting there. I think the future of Parkinson's disease and DBS, like Mr. Foley said, is now about doing this surgery earlier. Before, 18 years ago, the risk was 1% death. We have decreased that down to 0.1% or less, partly because of all of the technologies. It had potential for stroke. And the reason is because when 18 years ago I came to Mayo, I did not get all of these imaging that I now have access to, meaning that I didn't have images of all the blood vessels. But now, because I know where the blood vessels are, I know how to target very carefully. So what I want to do in closing is thank all of you for coming to events like this. Again, I want to congratulate Mr. Foley for an amazing event, and I want to thank all of you for listening to this presentation. Thank you.